The blood-orange sun dipped below the horizon as Katherine Neville stood at the edge of her property, squinting at the dusty trail that hadn't carried her husband home in nearly 6 months. The promise he'd made before leaving, "I'll be back before the first snow falls." Katie, echoing hollowly in her mind as the autumn wind nipped at her cheeks. The year was 1874, and the Wyoming Territory was no place for a woman alone, especially with winter's approach, turning the golden prairie grass brittle and the nights stretching longer with each passing day. Katherine pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her worn wedding band catching the last light of day. Adam had ridden south to Cheyenne for a cattle sale in May, planning to return with enough money to see them through another year on their struggling homestead. Her daily ritual of watching the road had become as regular as feeding the chickens or milking their single cow. Neighbors from the nearby settlement had begun giving her pitying looks when she came to town for supplies. The whispers followed her talk of outlaws, disease, or simply a husband who'd found greener pastures elsewhere. Katherine refused to entertain any of these thoughts, even as doubt crept in with the evening chill. "Madam, you'll catch your death out here," came a deep voice from behind her. Katherine turned, startled to find a tall figure leading a horse toward her cabin. In the dimming light, she could make out the broad shoulders and the unmistakable silhouette of a cowboy's hat. Her hand instinctively moved to the pocket of her skirt, where she kept a small derringer. "State your business," she called, proud that her voice didn't betray the fear coursing through her veins. The stranger stopped a respectful distance away. "Name's Quentin Abernathy. I'm looking for work and shelter before nightfall, willing to pay my way with labor." He gestured to the sagging fence line and the half-repaired barn roof. Katherine hesitated. Adam had always said to turn away drifters, but winter was coming, and there was work that needed doing, work that required more strength than she possessed. The light caught the stranger's face as he stepped closer, revealing a weather-beaten countenance with kind eyes that somehow put her at ease. "I've got a barn where you can sleep," she said finally. "We'll discuss work in the morning, but know this, I keep this loaded." She patted her pocket. A smile touched the cowboy's lips. "Yes, madam, wouldn't expect anything less." As they walked toward the cabin, Katherine noticed his slight limp. "You're injured? Old wound," he replied. "Axe up in the cold, nothing that would keep me from honest work." That night, Katherine lay awake listening to the wind rattling the shutters. She thought of Adam, wondering for the 100th time what had delayed him. She thought of the tall stranger in her barn, hoping she hadn't made a terrible mistake. And she thought of the long winter ahead, unsure if her provisions or her resolve would last until spring. Morning came with a biting chill. Katherine had risen before dawn, as was her habit, to stoke the fire and begin the day's work. She was surprised to find Quentin already at the water pump, filling the buckets she normally struggled with each morning. "Hope you don't mind," he said, setting the brimming buckets by the cabin door. "Figured you'd need these first thing." Katherine nodded, clutching her shawl around her nightdress. "Thank you. I'll fix us some breakfast once I'm dressed." Over a simple meal of cornmeal mush and the last of her summer preserves, Katherine explained her situation. "My husband, Adam, went to sell our cattle. He promised to be back before the first snow. That was 6 months ago." Quentin listened silently, his expression revealing nothing. "I can offer you room and board through winter in exchange for help with the heavy work," she continued. "I can't pay wages until Adam returns with our money." "That's fair," Quentin agreed. "I've been riding for months looking for steady work. Winter's no time to be on the trail." He didn't ask what had delayed her husband, and Katherine was grateful for his discretion. That day set the pattern for those that followed. Quentin rose early and worked tirelessly, repairing fences, patching the roof, chopping enough firewood to last months, and hunting to supplement their dwindling stores. Katherine found herself watching him sometimes, his sure movements and quiet competence reminding her of Adam in a way that brought both comfort and guilt. A week passed, then 2. October's chill gave way to November's bite, and still, the road remained empty of Adam's return. Katherine began to accept what her neighbors had been suggesting: something had happened to prevent his return. Still, she couldn't bring herself to speak the fear aloud. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Quentin broke their comfortable silence. "If you don't mind me asking, Mrs. Neville, how long have you been out here alone?" Catherine's hands stilled in her mending. "Since May, and please call me Catherine. Mrs. Neville makes me feel like my mother-in-law." A ghost of a smile crossed Quentin's face. "Catherine, then," he hesitated. "Have you considered that your husband might have met with trouble?" The bluntness of his question should have offended her, but instead, Catherine felt something loosen in her chest, the relief of finally acknowledging what she'd feared for months. "Yes," she admitted softly. "But what am I to do? I can't leave to search for him. I can barely keep this place running." She gestured to their surroundings, the small cabin that had been her dream and had now become her prison. Quentin's gaze was steady. "I could ride to Cheyenne, ask around, might be someone knows something." Catherine looked up, surprised by the offer. "Why would you do that for strangers?" "You're not exactly strangers anymore," he replied, "and I've been on both sides of waiting for news. It's the not knowing that eats at you." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. "Thank you, but no. Winter's too close now. It would be foolish to risk another life." She forced a smile. "Besides, who would chop all that firewood if you left?" Quentin nodded, respecting her decision even as concern lingered in his eyes. That night, for the first time since Adam had left, Catherine allowed herself to cry quietly into her pillow, where the cowboy sleeping in her barn wouldn't hear her weakness. The first snow came 3 days later, earlier than usual. Catherine woke to a world transformed, the familiar landscape covered in a pristine blanket of white. She stood at the window, watching the flakes continue to fall, feeling a finality in the scene. Adam had promised to return before the first snow. That promise now lay broken under winter's first assault. Quentin found her still standing there when he came to the door, his hat and shoulders dusted with white. The look they exchanged needed no words. They both knew what this meant. "I'll get the animals settled for the storm," he said simply, turning back into the swirling white. That day marked a shift between them. It wasn't spoken, but Catherine felt it, the acceptance that Adam might never return, and the acknowledgement that she and Quentin had become something more than temporary arrangements. He began taking his meals at her table instead of in the barn. She found herself laughing at his quiet humor. The barrier of propriety remained, but within it, a friendship took root. As November deepened, so did the snow and the cold. They fell into a rhythm of shared work and companionable evenings. Catherine learned that Quentin had been a ranch hand in Texas before the war, had fought for the Union despite his southern roots, and had been drifting ever since, carrying wounds that went deeper than his visible limp. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Quentin spoke of his family lost to fever when he was serving in the war. "Came home to empty graves and a sold homestead," he said, staring into the fire. "Nothing to keep me anywhere since then." Catherine's heart ached for him. "Is that why you keep moving? Because nowhere feels like home?" His eyes met hers across the dim room. "Partly, and partly because it's easier than staying somewhere long enough to lose people again." The honesty of his confession moved her. "I understand that feeling," she admitted. "After my parents died, I was so afraid of being left again. Then I met Adam and he promised he'd never leave." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Look how that turned out." "He might not have had a choice," Quentin said gently. "I know," Catherine sighed. "That's what makes it worse. Not knowing if he abandoned me or if he's—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "Either way, you've been carrying on," Quentin observed. "That takes courage, or stupidity," she countered with a wry smile. "Most women would have gone back east by now." Quentin shook his head. "Not stupidity. Faith in yourself in this land." His gaze swept their surroundings. "You've built something good here, Catherine, something worth fighting for." His words warmed her more than the fire. For months, she'd felt like a failure for struggling, for needing help. Quentin saw strength where she had only seen survival. As December settled in, Catherine noticed Quentin watching the road as she once had, his eyes scanning the white horizon whenever he was outside. She knew he was looking for signs of Adam, though whether from hope or wariness she couldn't tell. The days grew shorter, the nights longer and colder. On the darkest evening of the year, Katherine pulled out her small collection of Christmas decorations paper stars she'd cut herself, pine boughs gathered from the nearby woods, and a single treasured ornament her mother had given her. Quentin watched her transform their sparse cabin with these simple touches. "My wife used to do the same," he said quietly, then looked startled at his own admission. Katherine paused in her work. "You were married," Quentin nodded, his expression distant. "Briefly, before the war. She died in childbirth while I was away fighting. The baby too." "I'm so sorry," Katherine whispered, understanding now the depth of loss behind his restless wandering. "It was a long time ago," he said, but his eyes told a different story. Katherine hesitated, then crossed the room to touch his arm gently. "Thank you for telling me." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, recognition of shared grief, of understanding that went beyond words. For a moment, Katherine felt a connection she'd thought lost forever when Adam hadn't returned. The moment broke when Quentin stepped away, clearing his throat. "I should check on the animals before the temperature drops further." Left alone, Katherine pressed a hand to her chest, startled by the rapid beating of her heart. She was a married woman, she reminded herself firmly. Adam might still return. And even if he didn't, even if the worst had happened, her period of mourning wouldn't properly begin until she had confirmation. Yet as the days passed, Katherine found herself increasingly aware of Quentin, the strength in his hands as he worked, the kindness in his smile, the way his presence filled the small cabin. She told herself it was natural, being isolated together through the winter months. Nothing could come of it. Nothing should. Christmas came, bringing a temporary respite from the harshness of winter. They exchanged simple gifts, a new pair of woolen socks Katherine had knitted in secret for Quentin, and a hand-carved wooden comb he'd made for her during the long evenings. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the smooth pine. "Not as fine as you deserve," he replied, "but it should serve until better can be had." The way he looked at her made Katherine wonder if he was speaking only of the comb. New Year's Eve brought unexpected visitors, the Jenkinses from the neighboring homestead, arriving on a horse-drawn sleigh with food and good cheer. Their presence reminded Katherine of the world beyond her small holding, of the community that had given her space to wait for Adam but hadn't forgotten her. "We've been worried about you, dear," Martha Jenkins said as the men stepped outside to check on the sleigh. "Living out here with only a stranger for company." "Mr. Abernathy has been nothing but respectful," Katherine assured her, aware of how their arrangement might appear to others. "He sleeps in the barn and has been a godsend with the heavy work." Martha patted her hand. "I'm sure he has, dear." But people talk, and with no word from Adam in so long, she hesitated. "Some are saying it might be time to accept what's happened and move forward." Katherine stiffened. "I haven't received any confirmation that Adam isn't coming back. Of course not, dear. I just mean winter is hard enough without facing it alone. No one would blame you for securing your future." Before Katherine could reply, the men returned, bringing a blast of cold air and changing the subject. But Martha's words lingered, raising questions Katherine had been avoiding. After their guests departed, the cabin seemed quieter than before. Quentin stoked the fire while Katherine put away the leftover food. "Nice folks," he commented. "Mrs. Jenkins seems concerned about you." Katherine sighed. "She thinks I should declare Adam dead and find a new husband before I lose the homestead." Quentin's movements stilled. "Is that a risk, losing your land, eventually?" Katherine sat heavily in her chair. "The claim is in Adam's name. I can work it in his absence, but if he's declared dead or abandons it, I'd have to file a new claim as a widow, and a woman alone." She shrugged. "The land office doesn't look favorably on that, no matter what the law says. What will you do?" His voice was carefully neutral. Katherine looked up at him, suddenly aware of how much his opinion had come to matter. "I don't know. What would you do?" Quentin considered the question seriously. "I'd give it until spring," he said finally, "when the pass is clear, if there's still no word by then." He left the sentence unfinished. Katherine nodded, grateful for his practical approach. "Until spring, then." That night, lying in her bed listening to the wind, Katherine realized something had changed. For months, her every thought had been of Adam, where he was, what had happened, when he would return. Tonight, she found herself thinking instead of Quentin his steady presence, his quiet strength, the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. The realization brought guilt, but also a flutter of something she hadn't felt since Adam first courted her possibility. January brought bitter cold and more snow. Their world narrowed to the cabin, the barn, and the path between. Quentin taught Katherine how to play chess using pieces he carved from leftover firewood. She taught him the card games her father had shown her as a child. Their evenings stretched long, filled with conversation and comfortable silences. One night, as a storm raged outside, Quentin spoke of his dreams before the war, the ranch he'd hoped to build, the family he'd planned to raise. "Funny how life takes you places you never expected," he mused. "You still want those things?" Katherine asked. "A home, a family." "Sometimes I think I'm too broken for that now," he admitted. "But being here," he glanced around the cabin, his gaze lingering on her, "it reminds me of what could be." Katherine felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I never planned to be a frontier wife," she confessed. "I was going to be a school teacher in St. Louis. Then I met Adam at a church social, and suddenly I was heading west with a trunk full of books and no idea what I was getting into." "Do you regret it?" She considered the question carefully. "I regret how hard it's been, how lonely. But I don't regret the life we tried to build." She looked around at the home she'd created. "I don't regret this place. It suits you," Quentin said softly. "You belong here, Katherine, more than many who try to tame this land." His words touched her deeply. Adam had always seen her as somewhat fragile, needing protection from the harsh realities of frontier life. Quentin saw her strength, her resilience. As January gave way to February, Katherine noticed Quentin's limp worsening with the cold. One evening, she found him grimacing as he removed his boot by the fire. "Let me see," she said, kneeling before him before he could protest. Reluctantly, he rolled up his pant leg, revealing an ugly scar running from knee to ankle. Katherine gasped softly. "Confederate saber," he explained. "Doctors wanted to take the leg, but a field nurse saved it. Never healed quite right." Katherine retrieved a jar of salve she'd made from herbs. "May I?" After a moment's hesitation, Quentin nodded. Her fingers worked gently, massaging the aromatic mixture into his scarred flesh. She felt the tension in his muscles, saw his hands grip the chair arms as she worked. "Thank you," he said gruffly when she finished, quickly covering his leg again. "We all have our scars," Katherine said quietly. "Some are just more visible than others." Their eyes met, and for a breathless moment, Katherine thought he might reach for her. Instead, he stood carefully, testing his weight on the leg. "Better," he admitted. "Much obliged." After that night, something shifted again between them, a new awareness, an unspoken tension. Their hands would brush as they passed items at dinner. Their eyes would meet across the room and linger a moment too long. Katherine found herself taking extra care with her appearance despite the isolation, and noticed Quentin had begun shaving more regularly. February brought a brief thaw, allowing Quentin to repair storm damage to the barn and Katherine to check on her small flock of chickens, which had miraculously survived the worst of winter. They worked side by side, their bodies finding a natural rhythm together. "You never said where you were headed before you stopped here," Katherine remarked as they cleared ice from the water trough. "Wasn't headed anywhere particular," Quentin replied, "just moving on like always. And now, when spring comes," he paused, his axe mid-swing, "that depends." "On what?" His eyes met hers. "On whether there's a reason to stay." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was ready to acknowledge fully. Katherine felt her heart quicken but forced herself to look away. "I suppose we'll both have decisions to make when the snow melts," she said carefully. That night, a fresh storm moved in, burying their brief taste of freedom under another foot of snow. Confined once more to the cabin, they sat before the fire, Quentin whittling a piece of wood while Katherine mended a shirt. "What will you do?" Quentin asked suddenly, "if Adam never returns?" Katherine's needle stilled. It was the first time either had stated so bluntly what they'd both been thinking. "I don't know," she admitted. "Try to keep the homestead, I suppose, though the land office might have other ideas." You could remarry, Quentin suggested, his eyes on his carving. Plenty of men would be fortunate to have a wife like you. Katherine studied him, wondering at the neutrality in his voice. Is that what you'd advise, a marriage of convenience? No, he said, looking up at last. Not of convenience. The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. For the first time, Katherine allowed herself to fully acknowledge what had been growing between them, something neither had sought but which had taken root nonetheless. It would be wrong, she whispered, though whether to him or herself she wasn't sure. Yes, he agreed. While there's still hope he's alive. The acknowledgement of boundaries should have eased the tension, but instead it only highlighted the depth of feeling those boundaries contained. February stretched on, each day bringing them closer to the spring that would force decisions neither was ready to make. They maintained their careful distance, yet found themselves creating excuses to be near one another, reading by the same lamp, working on tasks that required two pairs of hands. One night, unable to sleep, Katherine ventured from her bedroom to find Quentin still awake, staring into the dying fire. He'd taken to sleeping on a pallet by the hearth on the coldest nights, when the barn offered little protection from the bitter cold. Can't sleep? He asked, looking up at her approach. Katherine shook her head, wrapping her shawl tighter around her nightdress. Too many thoughts, he nodded, understanding without explanation. Would you like some tea? I could stoke the fire. No, thank you. She hesitated, then sat in the chair opposite him. Quentin, I need to ask you something. His expression grew wary. All right. If you were in Adam's place, if something had happened to prevent your return, would you want your wife to wait forever, to put her life on hold indefinitely? Quentin considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. No, he said finally. I'd want her to be safe, to be provided for. He met her gaze steadily. To be happy even if it couldn't be with me. Katherine nodded slowly. That's what I keep telling myself Adam would want. But then I feel guilty for even considering a life without him. Considering possibilities isn't betrayal, Katherine, it's survival. Is that all it is? Survival? She hadn't meant to ask so directly, but the words escaped before she could stop them. Quentin's expression softened. No, not all. The admission hung between them, neither willing to take the next step, but both acknowledging that something had grown in the winter months that neither had expected. March arrived with warming temperatures and melting snow. The road to town became passable again, and Quentin offered to make the journey for supplies. I could ask about Adam while I'm there, he suggested carefully. Sometimes news comes with the spring thaws. Katherine nodded, torn between hope and fear of what he might learn. Thank you. I'd appreciate that. He left at dawn, promising to return by nightfall. Katherine kept herself busy with spring cleaning, trying not to watch the sun's progress across the sky or listen for hoofbeats. When dusk fell with no sign of him, she told herself not to worry. The journey could easily take longer than expected, with the roads still muddy from melting snow. Night had fully fallen when she finally heard a horse approaching. She rushed to the door, relief flooding through her at the sight of Quentin's familiar silhouette. I was beginning to worry, she called as he dismounted. Roads were worse than I expected, he explained, leading his horse toward the barn. And I stopped to talk with the sheriff. Katherine's heart lurched. About Adam, Quentin nodded, his expression grim in the lantern light. Let's get inside. There's news. Those words, both dreaded and longed for, sent a chill through Katherine that had nothing to do with the night air. She waited at the table while Quentin settled his horse, her hands clasped tightly before her. When he finally entered, he removed his hat and coat slowly, as if delaying the moment. I'm sorry, Katherine, he said gently. The sheriff received word last week. Adam's body was found near the Colorado border last fall. They only just made the identification from papers he was carrying. The world seemed to tilt beneath Katherine. Though she had suspected, had even begun to accept this possibility, the confirmation hit her with physical force. How? She managed to ask. Appears he was robbed on the trail back from Cheyenne. Sheriff said they found him with an empty money belt and a bullet in his back. Quentin's voice was soft with regret. He must have been on his way home to you. Katherine closed her eyes, grief washing over her in waves. Adam had kept his promise after all. He had tried to return before winter. The fact that he had died attempting to come back to her was both a comfort and a fresh wound. "I'm so sorry," Quentin said again, and she felt his hesitant touch on her shoulder. The simple gesture broke something in her. Katherine turned, burying her face against his chest as sobs tore through her body. Quentin's arms came around her, holding her steady as grief finally found its release. How long they stood there, she couldn't have said. Eventually, the storm of tears subsided, leaving Katherine drained but somehow lighter. She drew back, embarrassed by her breakdown. "Forgive me," she murmured, wiping at her eyes. "Nothing to forgive." Quentin's voice was rough with emotion. "You loved him." "Yes," she agreed, "I did." That night, Katherine slept deeply for the first time in months, the certainty of Adam's fate, however tragic, providing a closure she had been unable to find in limbo. Morning brought a strange calm. Katherine rose early, making breakfast as usual. When Quentin appeared, he studied her carefully. "How are you?" he asked, genuine concern in his eyes. "I'm at peace, I think," she replied. "At least now I know," he nodded, accepting her assessment. "The sheriff said you should come to town when you're ready. There are papers to sign, legal matters concerning the homestead." Did he say if I'd be able to keep the land? He thought so, given the circumstances, but it would be best to file the widow's claim soon. Widow. The word felt strange, yet it gave definition to what she had suspected for months. Katherine was a widow now, not a wife waiting for her husband's return. They rode to town together the following day. The journey was largely silent, each lost in private thoughts. Katherine felt the curious stares as they entered the small settlement, a widow and the stranger who'd wintered with her, fodder for gossip that had likely already been circulating. The sheriff was kind but businesslike, confirming what Quentin had already told her and providing the necessary papers to file her claim as a widow. The storekeeper offered condolences along with her purchases. By the time they turned toward home, Katherine felt drained by the performance of grief for public consumption when her private mourning had begun months ago. "Are you all right?" Quentin asked as they rode side by side. "Yes," she said after a moment's consideration. "It's strange I've been preparing for this news for so long that now it's here, I almost feel guilty for not feeling worse." "You've been grieving since winter came without him," Quentin observed. "There's no right way to mourn, Katherine." His understanding eased something in her chest. "What happens now?" she asked, the question encompassing far more than just the practical aspects of her new status. Quentin was quiet for several long moments. "That's for you to decide," he said finally. "You're free to make your own choices now." The word free struck Katherine as both liberating and terrifying. Free to determine her own future, but also free from the vows that had guided her life for years. "And you?" she asked, unable to look at him. "What will you do now that spring is here?" "That depends," he said, echoing his words from weeks earlier. "On what?" "On whether there's a reason to stay." Katherine gathered her courage and turned to face him directly. "I think there might be," she said softly. A smile slowly spread across his face, the first genuine one she'd seen since he'd returned with the news about Adam. "I think so too." They didn't speak of it further on the ride home, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities that had been forbidden until now. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity as they prepared the homestead for spring planting. Katherine filed her widow's claim and was relieved when it was accepted without contest. Quentin remained, his status changing subtly from temporary helper to permanent partner in the farm's operation. They still maintained separate sleeping quarters, Katherine in her bedroom, Quentin now in the small lean-to attached to the cabin rather than the barn. Propriety demanded at least that much, though both were acutely aware of the growing tension between them. April brought green shoots in Katherine's small garden and new calves in the modest herd they were building. The future of the homestead looked more secure than it had in a year, largely due to Quentin's experienced management and Katherine's determination. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, Quentin cleared his throat nervously. "Katherine," he began, "I've been thinking about my future." Her heart sank. fearing he was about to announce his departure now that the homestead was on more solid footing. "I've wandered for years," he continued, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. "But these past months being here with you," he turned to face her directly. "I've found something I thought was lost to me forever." "What's that?" she asked, hardly daring to hope, a sense of home, of purpose. He reached for her hand, of connection. Catherine's breath caught as his fingers entwined with hers. "I've felt it too," she admitted. "When Adam didn't return, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered, but then you came and gradually, he agreed with a small smile. "It's too soon," she said, though she didn't withdraw her hand. "People would talk. Let them." Quentin's gaze was steady. "I'm not asking for vows today, Katherine, just the chance to stay, to build something together at the pace that feels right to you." The honesty in his proposal touched her deeply. He wasn't offering marriage yet, but commitment, the promise to remain when all his life had been spent leaving. "I'd like that," she said simply. His smile was like sunrise breaking. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, a beginning rather than a demand. When they parted, Katherine felt a warmth she had thought lost forever. Spring turned to summer, and with it, their relationship blossomed from cautious friendship to open affection. They worked side by side during the day, and in the evenings, they sat together on the porch, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the companionable silence. Occasionally, Quentin would read aloud from one of Catherine's precious books, his voice bringing the words to life in a way that made her fall in love with the stories all over again. The neighbors, initially scandalized by their arrangement, gradually accepted Quentin's presence as Katherine publicly maintained the proprieties of her mourning period. Martha Jenkins, ever practical, had been the first to openly approve. "Life's too short and too hard out here to worry about calendar pages when it comes to happiness," she declared during a visit. "Adam would want you provided for." By late summer, when the wheat stood golden in their fields and the apple trees Katherine had planted 3 years earlier bore their first real harvest, Quentin finally spoke the words that had been building between them for months. They were picking apples together, Quentin lifting Katherine to reach the higher branches, both laughing as they worked. When he set her down, he didn't release her waist immediately. "Marry me, Katherine," he said, the words simple and direct, like the man himself. She turned in his arms, studying the face that had become as dear to her as her own reflection. "Are you certain this life, it's hard, unforgiving sometimes?" "I've never been more certain of anything," he replied. "When I rode onto this homestead last autumn, I was just looking for temporary shelter. I found a home instead. I found you." Katherine thought of Adam, of the love they'd shared and the dreams they'd built. She would always carry him in her heart. But her life stretched before her now, and Quentin had shown her that it was possible to love again, differently but no less deeply. "Yes," she said, rising on tiptoes to seal her answer with a kiss. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed in October, just before the anniversary of Quentin's arrival. The ceremony was small, just the local pastor, the Jenkinses, and a few other neighbors as witnesses. Katherine wore a new blue dress rather than white, acknowledging her past while embracing her future. The winter that followed was as harsh as the previous one, but so different in every other way. The cabin that had once felt like a prison now hummed with warmth and purpose. They worked together during the day, and at night they shared the bedroom that had once been Catherine's alone. In those intimate moments, Katherine discovered new aspects of herself, a boldness, a passion that had remained dormant in her first marriage. Quentin's love unleashed something in her that made her feel truly alive for the first time. "I never expected this," she confessed one night, lying in his arms as snow fell softly outside. "When Adam didn't return before winter, I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning." Quentin drew her closer. "Sometimes life's harshest storms bring unexpected gifts." "Like a limping cowboy showing up at my door," he laughed softly. Exactly like that, spring arrived again, bringing new life to the land and to their home. Catherine's belly began to round with the child they had created together, a symbol of their love and their future on the land they both cherished. Standing together on their porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine leaned back against Quentin's solid warmth. "You ever think about how different our lives would be if you hadn't stopped here that day?" she asked. "Every day," he admitted, his hands cradling her growing belly protectively. "I'd still be wandering, carrying my ghosts with me. Instead, I found a reason to stay." Her husband promised to return before winter. He never did, Catherine murmured. "The cowboy did." "And I always will," Quentin promised, turning her gently to face him. "Every winter, every spring, every season for the rest of our lives." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Catherine stood secure in the certainty that some promises were meant to be broken so that others could be made. The road that had remained empty of Adam's return had instead brought Quentin into her life, a different journey than she had planned, but one filled with unexpected joy. Their homestead flourished in the years that followed. Their daughter, born the next winter, was joined by a brother 2 years later. The orchard Catherine had planted grew into a local landmark, and Quentin's skill with horses built them a reputation that brought buyers from as far as Cheyenne. Sometimes, when the wind blew from the south, Catherine would think of Adam and the life they had planned together. She would always mourn what might have been. But as she watched Quentin teaching their son to ride or braiding their daughter's hair with surprisingly gentle fingers, she felt a profound gratitude for the unexpected turn her life had taken. Her husband had promised to return before winter. He never did. But the cowboy who arrived instead had brought with him a different kind of spring after her long winter of waiting a rebirth she could never have imagined in those dark days of uncertainty. And every night, as they lay together in the home they had built, Catherine thanked whatever fate or providence had brought Quentin Abernathy to her door that autumn day, when the blood-orange sun had dipped below the horizon, and hope had seemed as distant as the stars.